The Witch of Blackbird Pond, Chapter 18, Part 2. Rachel started forward, but Matthew motioned her back. "Get her coat," he ordered. They stood waiting silently in the hallway while Rachel climbed the stairs, weeping, and came back with her own woolen cloak. "Yours feels damp," she quavered. "Keep this on you, Kit. May be cold in that place." The Cruffs walked behind them all the way along High Street, down Carpenter's Lane to the constable's house, and stood by till they saw Kit safely in the shed and heard with their own ears the heavy bolt drop in place outside the door. The shed was entirely empty, save for a pile of straw in one corner of the dirt floor. There was no window, but the rough boards let in chinks of daylight, as well as drafts of November cold air. Kit leaned against the doorpost and let the tears run down her cheeks. Toward late afternoon, when one side of the shed was already deep in shadows, she heard footsteps. The bolt drew back, and the constable's face peered through the door. "Brought some supper," he growled. "My wife sent this." He thrust toward her a heavy quilt, none too clean even in that dim light, but a gesture of kindness nonetheless. "We never had a girl in here before," he explained uneasily. "Funny thing, I'd never have picked you for a witch, but you can't tell." "Please," Kit ventured. "Those other women you spoke of, Goody Harrison and the other, what happened to them?" "Goody Harrison was banished from the colony. They hanged Goody Johnson." Then, seeing the horror that blanched her face, he reconsidered. I hardly think they'd be so hard on you," he consoled her, "being you're so young in the first offense. More likely they'll brand you or cut off an ear." He slammed shut the door again. Whatever might be in that wooden bowl, she had no heart even to taste it. She had begun to shake again, and the quilt did not warm her. She had never in all her life known the feeling of a locked door. It was all she could do to hold herself from pounding against it and screaming. If she should scream, who would hear her? Who was there anywhere who could help her? John Holbrook, perhaps? In his quiet way, he had a sort of strength and conviction. They might have listened to John, but he was far away in the wilderness of Massachusetts. Nate Eaton? He was halfway down the river and banished from town as well. William? Why, of course, William could help her. Why hadn't she thought of him at once? Anything William said would carry weight in the town. His position, his character were unquestioned. Could the magistrate for one moment hold the Cruff's word against a man like William? The thought steadied her. She thought of him coming to champion her, confident, unruffled, those wide, dependable shoulders like a fortress, between her and the angry face of Goodwife Cruff. Dear, dependable William. Perhaps he would come tonight. Kit drew a deep breath, and sitting on the floor, her knees drawn tight against her chest, she waited for William. I'm going to stop right here for just a second. I want to point out to those of you that are the literary device detectives, we had a simile here where it said, "Those wide, dependable shoulders like a fortress between her and the angry face of Goodwife Cruff." There's a comparison where Spear has compared William to a fort, using the words like or as. It's a simile. I wonder what she's trying to say about William by comparing him to a fort. It was Rachel who finally came instead. Long after dark, Kit heard her whisper outside the shed wall, so timid and faint that at first she thought she must have imagined it. "Kit, can you hear me? Are you all to rights?" "Yes. Oh, Aunt Rachel, you shouldn't have left them." "I had to know how you are. I knew you'd want to know, Kit. Dr. Bulkley says Mercy's fever is nearly gone." "I'm so glad. I wanted to help, and now I've left it all for you to do. Oh, Aunt Rachel, can you ever forgive me?" "Shush, child. 'Tis myself I can't forgive. To think I knew all along you were going to that place and I never spoke up. I'd have kept going anyway. But I never knew I'd shame you all like this. Aunt Rachel, what do they do to witches? There was a small sound outside the boards. Nothing, child, she whispered. They won't do anything to you. We'll think of something. But she had not spoken fast enough. That little sobbing catch of breath had answered first. The inquiry will be in the morning. Have courage, dear. But you've got to help us, Kit. If there's something you haven't told, something you're holding back, you must tell everything. How much courage it must have taken for Rachel to brave her husband's anger in the dark and the strange terror of a prison shed. I wish I could get some food into you. Are you very frightened, Kit dear? Not now, lied Kit. Not now that you've come. Thank you, Aunt Rachel. Sustained by her aunt's visit, Kit was able to face the morrow with less panic. She sat down and forced herself to take stock of her chances. She couldn't imagine that they could have much evidence against her, but it didn't seem to take much evidence to rouse these people's suspicion. What had poor Hannah ever done to harm them? Goodwife Cruff had hated her ever since that first day on the Dolphin, and she would never rest now till she had her vengeance. Nobody in town would have much sympathy for a disobedient girl. If only she could have obeyed her impulse this morning and told her uncle the whole story. Though perhaps he too was helpless, she saw now that she had undermined his authority in all eyes by flouting his orders. Suppose they discovered that Prudence too had disobeyed. It did not bear thinking, and she was entirely responsible for Prudence's actions, Kit admitted with a sick heart, who had inveigled the child with promises and thought of the hiding place under the willow tree and persuaded her, no, dragged her against her will, to meet Hannah. Oh, why hadn't she seen what she was doing? How could she have been so wicked? What difference did it make whether Prudence could read or not when she was half-starved and beaten and overworked? If I wanted to neglect my own work, Kit groaned in remorse, I might at least have been out in the Cruffs' field helping the poor child. And yet, how lovely it had been that last afternoon in the cabin. Leaning her forehead on her knees, Kit could almost feel herself there again. She could hear the crackling of the flames, the bubbling of the stew in the kettle, the scratching of the pen in Prudence's fingers, the creak of Hannah's chair, and the drowsy purring of the yellow cat. She could see the glow of the fire, but she could not feel its warmth. It was like gazing in a window from the cold outside at a forbidden room she could never enter again. She had not slept all the night before on the beach. Now, huddled inside the ragged quilt, she was sucked down in spite of herself into a black whirlpool of slumber, where nightmare phantoms whirled with her, nearer and nearer, towards some unknown horror. In the second to last paragraph, I have a couple of things I want to point out. Those of you that are literary device detectives, there were two things in here. There was an example of imagery, and if you remember, imagery is when the author uses descriptions that play on the five senses of sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. So we have an example of imagery here where it's very descriptive. We also have a simile here. The very last sentence of that second to last paragraph, the very last sentence, it says it was like gazing in at a window from the outside at a forbidden room she could never enter. There's a device there that compares two things using the words like or as. You need to figure out what that comparison is and what the author's trying to say by making that comparison. Also, those of you that are symbolism spies, I wonder if there might be some sort of symbols in here. Maybe a color, maybe a shape, maybe an image. Look and see if you can find something that's an example of a symbol.